In this film, we're going back to basics with the brush tool just to kind of explain how everything works and how to maximize your time when using brushes and things really. So first of all, I want to demonstrate the actual difference in the different types of brushes, and then at the end we're going to look at the little bit more advanced setting up of a brush. So let me first of all just revert back to my saved image, and the first thing to remember is that the brush only paints with the foreground color. So whatever the foreground color is going to be, that's basically what it's going to paint with. The brush obviously is accessed from the tools palette itself, goes without saying. So if you want to change to a specific color, you would click onto the foreground color from your color picker here, go and choose the color that you want, press OK, and straight away you're going to be able to actually paint. Now the brush obviously comes in a different softness or hardness that depends on what you set up for, and the first things to kind of familiarize yourself with is the top options panel here. So obviously we've got things like the presets, the brush choice, which is going to be coming here. Then we've got the options panel of the brush settings itself. Then we've got the blend modes that we're going to be using. Obviously the opacity to do with how much it's laying down. The flow rate will be the amount of pixels it spreads to, and then obviously the smoothing is the softness as well and things. So if you're using the likes of a pen tablet, you will have a slightly different control than the likes of a mouse. But you've obviously got to set that up in your setup of your pen tablet anyway. Okay, so to begin with, you're probably going to be swapping in and out of brushes quite a lot. So you're going to get used to the likes of right-clicking to actually select or bring up the actual palette here. That saves you going up to the top options panel the whole time. You're probably going to be using the likes of the brush settings, and you can see right next to my brush settings I've got the brushes that are here as well. You'll probably find the more artistic work that you're doing, you're probably going to find that you're going to be using this kind of choice of brushes as well as the brush settings quite a lot. So in the setting up of your panel, the way that you workflow, in other words how all your workspace looks, basically make sure that you've got easy access to these things. So remember, we can either go to the top here to actually click onto the actual brush palette. As far as the options, the little round soft edge 300 you can see here for a minute is obviously the brush that I've chosen at present. However, if I click it, I can choose another brush, and then straight away you can see that the icon has changed at the top. But you also saw on the right hand side here that basically the brush settings, because the panel was open, that also changed its whole look and feel and things, really just actually swapping into the next brush. Okay, back to basics. First things first, harder the brush. So in other words, you can see here I can change the size of the brush. So let's bring it down a little bit smaller. Obviously this depends on the resolution of your document anyway. So the smaller the resolution, in other words, if it's a very, very small file, the brush size is going to be much bigger because these are things are all based on pixels. Okay, so 100 here you can see is basically quite small. If I just either enter in a numeric like 200, that will save the actual brush now into that next size, or we can use the actual slider up and down, and that is going to actually affect the actual brush size. The key thing is though, is the hardness and the softness to be aware of. Now most of the time I work in portrait photography, and I'm using a softer brush element just because it naturally works well with my kind of styling. However, if I was looking more at the commercial style of photography where I'm having to do very specific refinements, I'm probably going to be using a harder brush. What's the difference in the two? Well, first of all, if we just swipe with a hard brush, you can see how hard the edges are here. And then if I just right click and we take this the hardness down to 0%, and I do the same thing, you can see that it has a lovely soft edge compared to the other. Now if I want to make the brush size bigger without having to go back and forth to the different panels, you're going to use the right bracket key on the keyboard, or if you want to make it smaller, you're going to actually press the left bracket, and each time you press it, it goes down in the sizing. So now you can see actually here, and if I want to actually swap into the harder brush from the palette, open once more. Let's just choose a different color for a minute just so you can see it, and then we can actually see that it's a hard brush and things. So first things first, hard and soft. Soft as a rule because it gives a lovely soft edge and a blend. Hard edge brush if you're being a little bit more specific for kind of more commercial kind of work. Then as far as the making the brush size bigger and smaller, you're going to increase the size by pressing the right bracket. You're going to change the color by clicking on to something within the scene or within the color picker palette here, and that will actually change its color. And then if we want to actually move to a softer brush, right click, choose the soft edge brush here, or go back and just change it from the slider and slide that down. And then once more, let's go and choose the color green again, and then we start to actually paint with a softer brush. So we've got different simple things to actually apply. Straight away we're going to work quicker because obviously we've learned the right bracket and the left bracket, and how to actually go ahead and choose the color picker. So remember, if you want to choose a specific color, you click on the the foreground color, and then you choose something within the image that you want to take color from, and then instantly it becomes the foreground color. If there's two kind of colors you're using quite often as far as within a certain image is concerned, in this case you can see the green background tone there, and we also got this beigey color, then perhaps I might want to actually select the beigey brown kind of color for my background, and then all I need to do is basically press X, and this swaps the foreground color to background, and then brings the background color forward, of course. So now it's actually going to paint in the way that we want it to. Once more, do the same thing, and all I'm doing is pressing the X key. So let's just go back to the beginning again, and we'll just go and pick a shocking color. Let's go and pick that pink up. I was going for a lot more shocking color there. And what I want to do first of all, let's just paint across so we can see we're still using the soft edge brush, but now let's look at the blend modes. So for instance, this is really going to change the dynamic along with the opacity and with a little bit of the flow. The main ones you're probably going to be playing around with is the blend mode and the actual opacity itself. So the blend modes work very, very similar to how we work with new layers when we're actually changing how it reacts with the layer below, and that's what we're doing here. So for instance, you've seen if I just paint here in normal mode, if I just go ahead and I go into the overlay, it starts to actually mix with the color that is below. Okay, so it starts to actually change the color. You can start to see the shape there and how it kind of mixes. Yep. And if I just go ahead and I just choose that vivid lime green for a minute, and let me just go back to a normal, and X, and I just make something a kind of a solid color there for a minute, and then I just put that pink back on top, change it back into the vivid light again, overlay, sorry. And then we start to actually paint across it. You'll see that as it gets to the green, it changes its way that it reacts and things. Okay. Now, if we change that to say color, it means that it looks at the color on top and it is going to replace it. So you can see how it's beginning to mix itself a little bit going through there. But as I start to actually paint across the background, let's choose a bigger brush, and we start to actually paint here, it changes the color, but it doesn't affect the actual darks much. It just adds the tone to it, so it adds an overall kind of feeling. So remember, these modes are very, very important. In the same way is the opacity. So if I just put the brush mode back to normal and I just swipe across, you can see. Remember, when you are using the brush, if you want a straight line, hold the shift key and then it will basically join the points together. So from here, pressing the shift key and down, that basically makes a straight line. So just clicking the point that you want to go, pressing the shift key, and then it will actually just go through. So we know what that does now. Now if we change the opacity, let's go 50, and we do it again, you can see it's beginning to show through the layer as well, but it's the amount of ink it's putting down. Now this isn't like a blend mode, because if I paint on top of 50% again, it's technically now 100%. So it's not showing through, whereas a blend mode would obviously allow it to actually show through below, as we just saw. So as far as the opacity, if you find yourself changing the opacities quite a lot, which I'm sure you will, you're probably not going to be going up to the opacity slider up here to either enter in a number. Just to the left hand side where it says opacity, you can see if you just hover near there, a finger comes up, and that's what we call a scrubby, and basically you can actually move it to the right to get bigger, left to actually be less, or so we can see here, or we can hit a numeric. So if I hit 7, it instantly jumps to 70%. If I hit 3, it goes to 30%. Now remember, if you're painting over the same area without letting go of the basic brush, it only applies the 30% of paint once. If I let go, and now I start to actually paint again on top, that is when it starts to add the second layer of paint on. So now we're at 60%. If I do the same thing and I start to actually paint over it again, it's 90%, and then obviously it's going to add more on to actually kind of go right up to the 100% as such really. So those are the key things. Now remember, the flow is just the way the actual paint itself affects the pixels around it. So let's just put it back to 100% by pressing 0, striping across here, we can see that. If I go now and I actually affect the flow, so I just go to 50% again, and I do the same thing. The softer brush, you can see how it doesn't bleed out as much, so that's to do with the flow, how it kind of affects the pixels around itself. So there's our kind of basic element to do with a basic brush. Okay, softness and hardness, changing the size on the fly by pressing the left and right bracket, understanding that we also have a blend mode, understanding that we can actually change the opacity with the numeric keypad, and obviously the way that the flow interacts as it spreads across the pixels, depending on the flow amount that you set. So once you've kind of understood the basics of that, we can start to actually look now at the brush settings.